Every night, my dad was the one who put me to bed. He would help me brush my teeth, then tuck me into my cozy, warm bed. And without fail, he would tell me the same story. It was always the story of Ben and Bobby. I had plenty of books in my room, thanks to my mom who read to me throughout the day. But my dad never touched those. He always stuck to that one story. I figured he must have memorized it from a book, or maybe it was something passed down to him when he was a kid. I loved hearing the story of Ben and Bobby. It had a way of calming me, helping me drift off to sleep before it was over. Over time, I memorized the entire thing and would sometimes say it along with my dad. It became one of those things that stuck with me, even as I got older. To this day, I can still remember every word of that story as if I had just heard it last night. The story itself went like this. Ben the bear lived a pretty normal life, with nothing too special about him. But he had a little friend, Bobby, who liked to cause trouble and strife. Most days, Bobby was well behaved, but now and then, he'd act out. Ben would do his best to keep him in line, though Bobby would sometimes break free, no doubt. One time, Bobby was hungry and decided to steal some food. Ben warned him not to, saying stealing was rude. But Bobby did not listen, took the food anyway, and off to his hiding spot he ran, planning to keep it all tucked away. Bobby's secret spot was under a big oak tree in the woods, where he stashed the stolen goods. Ben never did find that food, even after looking everywhere, and Bobby hoped it would stay hidden, kept away from everyone's care. Ben was kind, while Bobby, he was more than a bit silly. And that is the tale of Ben and Bobby. Seems innocent enough, right? A cute little story about two bears. I used to think so too, but after certain things came to light recently, I have come to realize that the story was far darker than it seemed at first glance. My dad passed away a few years ago. Losing him took a toll on all of us, but my mom was hit the hardest. She withdrew from everyone and everything, becoming more reclusive as time went on. I didn't see her much in those days as she shut herself off from the rest of us. It took years for me to rebuild any kind of relationship with her, but little by little, we began to reconnect. It was not quite like before, but eventually she invited me over once a week for coffee. During these visits, we would sit at the kitchen table and reminisce about old times, my childhood, school, all the good memories we shared. But one thing we never talked about was my dad. It was as if his memory was too painful for her to bear. One week, though, I felt the need to bring him up. I thought that maybe talking about him would help her heal. So I brought up the bedtime story he used to tell me. "Hey, Mom, do you remember that story Dad used to tell me every night? The one about Ben and Bobby?" I asked carefully, unsure of how she would react. She looked up from her coffee, a little confused. Maybe it was because I had not mentioned him in years, or maybe because she really had no idea what I was talking about. "No, I do not remember that one," she said after a pause. "You had a lot of books. I cannot recall every story." I was a little taken aback by her response. Dad told me that story every single night for years, so I thought she would remember it. I went on to explain that it was not from a book. He would recite it from memory without reading off a page, as if he knew it by heart. Mom frowned, looking even more puzzled. "I thought your father read you a different book each night. That is what he always told me." Now that was strange to me because he never read any of my books. I would have thought my own mother would know that. "What was this story about?" she asked, still sounding confused. "It was about two bears. One was named Ben, and the other was Bobby." I barely got those words out before she interrupted me, her voice serious now. "Did you say Bobby?" she asked, staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a bit uneasy. "The bear's name was Bobby." She did not say anything for a moment, then her face shifted into an expression of deep thought. "That is odd," she finally said. "Your father used to talk about a friend he had when he was young. His name was Bobby. Apparently, Bobby got him into a lot of trouble back then. I never met this Bobby. Your dad said that was a good thing. He told me he only saw him a couple of times after we started dating, and then he stopped seeing him altogether. He told me he had finally gotten rid of him. It is strange, though. Now that I think about it, I never saw any pictures of him or heard anyone else mention him. And now you are telling me that your dad made up a story with a bear named Bobby?" She fell silent, and I did not know what to say either. After a moment, she looked at me and asked, "Do you remember the whole story? Can you tell it to me?" I recited the entire story for her. She listened closely, her face expressionless the whole time. When I finished, she asked one more question. "Are you sure Bobby hid the food under an oak tree in the woods?" "Yeah, it was definitely an oak tree," I answered, growing more uneasy. "Why?" Her gaze shifted toward the window, her voice quieter now. "On our first date, your father took me to an old oak tree in Shelton Woods, about 10 minutes from here. He told me I was lucky Bobby did not interrupt our date." She stared past me for a long time, as if lost in her thoughts. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I think it is time for you to go now. I am sorry." Her tone was filled with a sadness that I could not quite place. I stood up, hugged her lightly, though she barely responded, and gathered my things to leave. Something felt off, but I did not push it. As I got into my car and started driving home, the oak tree kept coming back into my mind. I could not stop thinking about Bobby, the tree, and what my mom had said. I do not know what made me do it, but I suddenly found myself turning the car around and heading straight for Shelton Woods. About 15 minutes later, I found myself standing at the edge of Shelton Woods. I do not know what I was expecting to find, but something inside me told me I had to be here. The woods were thick, dark, and quiet, almost unnaturally so. There was an odd stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. I had no idea where exactly this oak tree was, but something was driving me to find it. As I wandered through the woods, I felt the weight of unease pressing down on me. It was like the deeper I went, the heavier the air got. After what felt like an eternity but could not have been more than 10 minutes, I saw it. The oak tree. It was massive, its branches stretching up toward the sky, blocking out most of the light. There was something ancient and eerie about it, like it had been there long before anyone else and had seen things nobody should ever know. I walked closer, drawn to the base of the tree. As I approached, a cold wave of dread washed over me. My heart started to race and my breathing became shallow. Something was very wrong here. I stood in front of the tree, staring down at the ground beneath it. The dirt looked off. It was not like the rest of the forest floor. It had been disturbed, dug up, and moved around, but not recently. The earth had settled back down over whatever was hidden beneath it, leaving only the faintest trace that it had been tampered with. For reasons I could not explain, I knelt down and started digging with my hands. As my fingers clawed through the dirt, that feeling of dread intensified. I did not know what I was looking for, but I knew I was going to find something terrible. My hands hit something solid after a few minutes. It felt like wood. I cleared away more dirt, revealing the rotting planks of an old wooden box. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pulled at the lid, and with a sickening creak, it came loose. Inside the box were bones, human bones. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The remains were old, but unmistakably those of a person. No, multiple people. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. This could not be real. My dad could not have done this. Could he? I thought back to the story he used to tell me. The story of Ben and Bobby, the stolen food, the hiding place, the oak tree. I wanted to believe it was all a coincidence, that this was some bizarre mistake. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it in my bones, the same ones I had just uncovered. My father had been hiding something all along, something monstrous. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the police. They arrived about an hour later, and by that time, I had managed to stumble back to my car, completely numb. I sat there staring at the trees, barely registering what was happening around me. I heard them talking, heard the words human remains and multiple victims, but it was like they were speaking through a fog. Nothing felt real. It took days for the full truth to come out. 4 bodies, all of them young women in their 20s, buried beneath that tree for over 30 years. The police confirmed that they had been murdered, each one violently, and the DNA evidence made it undeniable. My father was the killer. The news hit me like a freight train. The man who had raised me, the man who had told me bedtime stories every night, had murdered these women, and he had buried them under that oak tree, hiding them just like Bobby had hidden his stolen goods in the story. The parallels were too obvious to ignore. My dad had been confessing, in his own twisted way, through that story he had told me so many times. But the question that kept gnawing at me was the same one my mom had raised. Who was Bobby? Had my dad simply made him up as a way to cope with the things he had done? Or had there really been a Bobby, someone who had led him down this path of darkness? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Maybe Bobby was not a real person at all. Maybe he was something else, something that had taken root in my father's mind, pushing him toward unspeakable acts. I will probably never know for sure, and honestly, I do not think I want to. Some things are better left buried. After the discovery at Shelton Woods, things in my life spiraled out of control. The media swarmed our town. Reporters camped outside my house for weeks, all eager to get the scoop on the son of a serial killer. I became headline news not because of anything I had done, but because of my father's sins. People I had known my whole life suddenly looked at me differently, as if I was guilty by association. It was like the air around me had changed, thick with suspicion and whispers. I stopped going out much. My job gave me a leave of absence, but I knew what that really meant. They wanted me out of sight for a while, let the storm die down. My mom, on the other hand, completely shut down. She stopped returning my calls and messages, locking herself inside her house. I think finding out what Dad had done broke her in a way I could not even begin to understand. She had loved him, trusted him. For over 30 years, she had lived with a man who kept such a terrible secret. I did not know how to process it either, but I figured the least I could do was give her some space. I spent a lot of time alone in my apartment, just sitting there, trying to piece it all together. My thoughts would wander back to the story of Ben and Bobby. I kept replaying it in my head over and over again. It was almost like a puzzle that I was trying to solve. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Bobby was the key. I was sure of it. But who or what was Bobby? I began to dig through my father's old things, hoping to find some answers. I went through boxes of his belongings, searching for any clues. Old photos, letters, documents. I sorted through it all. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, just the usual stuff a man would keep over the years. But then I came across an old journal, one that I had never seen before. It was tucked away in a box in the attic, hidden beneath layers of old clothes and dusty books. Something about it sent a chill down my spine before I even opened it. The journal was worn and fragile, its pages yellowed with age. The first few entries were normal enough, mostly about mundane things, work, house repairs, and family events. But as I flipped through, the tone of the writing started to change. The entries grew darker, more erratic. And then about halfway through, I found the first mention of Bobby. "I saw Bobby again today," one entry read. "I thought I had finally gotten rid of him, but he showed up out of nowhere. He always knows how to find me." The next entry, a few days later, was even more unsettling. "Bobby keeps coming back. He says we have things to do, but I do not want to listen to him anymore. I am tired of this. I told him I am done, but he just laughed. I do not know how to make him go away." As I read on, it became clear that my dad had been haunted by this Bobby for most of his life. He wrote about Bobby the way someone might describe a bad influence, or even a tormentor. But what made my skin crawl was the way he spoke of Bobby as though he was a real person, someone who physically appeared and interacted with him. One entry in particular stood out to me. "I took Ellen to the oak tree today. Bobby was there watching. He always watches. I tried to ignore him, but it is hard. He wants me to do things. I am afraid of what might happen if I do not." Ellen, that was my mom's name. The oak tree, Shelton Woods. My father had written this not long after their first date. He had been seeing Bobby, or at least believed he was, even then. I sat back, feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. Was Bobby a figment of my father's imagination? A manifestation of some kind of mental illness? Or had Bobby been a real person, someone who had a hold on my dad, pulling him into the darkness? The more I read, the harder it became to separate what was real from what was not. My father's words grew more and more unhinged, describing terrible urges and a growing fear of Bobby. "Bobby's getting stronger," one entry said. "I can hear him even when he is not around. He talks to me at night, tells me what I should do. I do not want to listen, but I cannot shut him out anymore." There were no entries after that. I sat there for hours holding the journal in my lap, my mind spinning. This was not the dad I remembered. The man I knew had been loving, calm, and kind. He had been my hero, my protector. But this journal painted a different picture. It showed a man at war with something dark inside him, something he could not control. And then there was Bobby. I still could not figure out if Bobby had been real or just a creation of my father's troubled mind. But one thing was clear. Bobby had been the driving force behind everything my dad had done. The murders, the secrets, the guilt. It all traced back to him. I knew what I had to do next. I had to find out more about Bobby. After reading through the journal, I found myself stuck in a loop of fear and disbelief. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that Bobby wasn't just a figment of my father's imagination. The journal felt too real, too detailed. If Bobby was only in my dad's head, how had he influenced such horrifying actions? Who or what was Bobby? I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of my father standing in those woods. Bobby's shadow lurking nearby, whispering dark ideas into his ear. The story of Ben and Bobby kept replaying in my mind, but now it wasn't just a silly bedtime tale. It was something far more sinister, a coded message that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The next morning, I decided I needed to know more about the women my father had killed. I wanted to understand what had really happened, and maybe, just maybe, I could uncover more about Bobby. The police had released limited details to the public, but through some persistent calls and digging, I managed to get in contact with an old detective who had worked the cold cases before they were linked to my father. His name was Detective Harper, and he agreed to meet me for coffee. When we sat down, Harper had the tired, weathered look of a man who had seen too much. His gray hair was unkempt, and his eyes looked like they had not seen a good night's sleep in years. "I remember those cases," he said as he stirred his coffee. "They haunted me for a long time. We could never figure out who did it. Then your father's DNA matched. Well, I guess that put an end to it." I nodded, not really knowing how to respond. It still felt unreal to hear someone else talk about my dad like that. "What can you tell me about the victims?" I asked. Harper sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking out the window as if searching for the right words. "They were all young women around 24, give or take. Disappeared in different towns but always ended up buried in those woods. The weird thing was, none of them had anything in common. No links between them. It's like your father just picked them at random. But there has to be something, right?" I pressed. "Something that connected them?" Harper shrugged. "If there was, we never found it." I hesitated, unsure if I should bring up Bobby. It sounded crazy even to me, but I had to know. "Did my dad ever mention someone named Bobby?" I asked quietly. The detective's face darkened. He set his cup down slowly and looked at me with an intensity that made me squirm. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "He did, but only once." My heart skipped a beat. "What did he say?" "It was right after we arrested him," Harper explained. "We were interrogating him, trying to get him to confess. He was calm mostly, but at one point he looked up and said, 'It was not me, it was Bobby.' I asked him who Bobby was, but he clammed up after that. Never mentioned the name again." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "Did you think Bobby was real?" I asked. Harper stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Honestly, I did not know what to think. Your dad had no accomplices, no one who fit that name. We figured it was either a delusion or some kind of twisted way of deflecting guilt." I leaned in closer. "Do you think it was just in his head? Or could there have been a real Bobby?" Harper sighed again. "Look, kid, I've seen some things in my career that I can't explain. Sometimes people do terrible things because of their own demons, and sometimes, I do not know. Sometimes I think there is something else at play. But if you want my honest opinion, I think Bobby was just a way for your dad to cope with what he'd done. A scapegoat, His words were not comforting, but they stuck with me. If Bobby was not real, then that meant my father had acted alone, driven by something inside him that he could not control. But if Bobby was real, then what was he? A partner? A manipulator? Or something far worse? I left the meeting with more questions than answers. The thought of Bobby followed me everywhere, lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow. I found myself returning to the woods, standing at the edge of Shelton Woods, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. I thought maybe, just maybe, I would find something there that would give me closure. But every time I stepped into those woods, I felt like I was being watched. One night I had a dream. In it, I was a child again, lying in bed as my father sat beside me, telling me the story of Ben and Bobby. But this time the story was different. Instead of a playful bear and his mischievous friend, the two characters were darker, more menacing. Ben was not just a good bear trying to keep Bobby in line. He was struggling, terrified, trying to hold Bobby back from doing terrible things. "Bobby wants me to do bad things," Ben whispered in the dream, his voice trembling. "But I do not want to. I do not want to hurt anyone." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream felt too real, too close to what had been haunting me. I could not shake the feeling that Bobby, whatever or whoever he was not done with me yet. A few days later, I received a call from my mom. It was the first time I had heard from her in weeks. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "I need to see you," she said. "There's something I have to tell you." I stood there holding the phone, my mother's voice still echoing in my ears. She had never called me like that before, never sounded so shaken, so afraid. Something was wrong, and it ran deeper than the murder case or my father's hidden past. I could feel it. I could hear it in her voice. Without hesitation, I grabbed my car keys and headed out the door. The drive to my mother's house felt longer than usual, even though it was the same route I had driven dozens of times since Dad passed. Every mile felt heavier, weighed down by the unanswered questions swirling in my head. Who was Bobby? Was he real, or just a figment of my father's imagination? Some dark manifestation of his guilt? And what did my mother have to tell me that she couldn't say over the phone? When I pulled up to the house, I noticed her front porch light flickering, casting an eerie glow over the yard. The house itself seemed different, somehow darker, like the weight of years of secrets had settled into its walls. I knocked, and when my mother opened the door, I barely recognized her. She looked pale, gaunt even, as if something had drained the life from her. She stepped aside and motioned for me to come in without a word. We sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. She stared at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a few minutes, we just sat there in silence, the only sound being the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, she spoke. "Do you remember the day your father passed?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Of course," I replied, unsure of where she was going with this. "I never told you everything about that day," she said. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. "He didn't die peacefully in his sleep, like I told you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "I found him in his study," she continued. "He was talking to someone, but there was no one there." My pulse quickened. "Who was he talking to?" She hesitated, her lips trembling. "He kept saying the name Bobby over and over again. He was arguing, shouting, like he was having a full conversation with someone, but no one else was in the room." I felt my stomach drop. The mention of Bobby again sent a jolt of fear through me. "After a while, he just stopped," she whispered. "He collapsed. That's when I called the paramedics. But before they arrived, before he took his last breath, he said something else." She paused as if unsure whether to continue. "What did he say?" I asked, leaning forward. "He said, I never should have let him in." Her voice cracked. I never understood what he meant until now. I sat back, trying to process her words. My father had spent his final moments talking to Bobby, the same name he had used to explain away the murders. Could it be that Bobby was more than just a story? More than just a scapegoat for my father's crimes? And what did he mean by "let him in"? "I think your father was hiding something far darker than we ever realized," my mother said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something that he couldn't control." I wanted to tell her that it was impossible, that Bobby was just a figment of Dad's mind, a way for him to cope with what he had done. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Something I had been ignoring all along. "I found something else," she said suddenly, standing up and walking to a drawer in the corner of the room. She pulled out a small, weathered envelope and handed it to me. "I found this after your father died, hidden in his study." The envelope felt old and brittle in my hands, the paper yellowed with age. I hesitated for a moment, then carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. The ink was faded, but still legible. It read, "To my son, if you are reading this, then it means I am gone, and there are things I need you to know. Things I never had the courage to tell you face to face. You see, Bobby is not just a name I conjured up to ease my guilt or make sense of the terrible things I did. Bobby is real, but not in the way you might think. I met him when I was just a boy, not much older than you were when I started telling you the bedtime stories. He came to me one night in the woods, and from that moment on, he never left. At first, I thought he was just an imaginary friend, something I created to cope with the loneliness I felt as a child. But as I grew older, I realized that Bobby was something else entirely. He started small, whispering in my ear, telling me to do things, little things that seemed harmless at the time. But as the years went on, the whispers grew darker, more insistent. I tried to ignore him, but he always found a way to get through to me. He became a part of me, a voice in my head that I could never silence. The things I did, the lives I took, they were not just my actions. Bobby was there, pushing me, guiding me, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never get rid of him. I thought I could control him. I thought I could keep him at bay by telling you the stories, by giving him a place in our bedtime ritual. But I was wrong. Bobby cannot be controlled. He is far more powerful than I ever realized. I am sorry for what I have done and for the burden I am leaving you with. I wish I could explain more, but there are things about Bobby that even I do not fully understand. All I know is that he is real and he is not finished. I hope that you can find a way to do what I could not, to break free from him. The letter slipped from my hands as I finished reading, and I felt a chill settle over me. My father's words were clear. Bobby was not just a part of his imagination. He was real in some way, and he had controlled my father's actions for years. But how? And why had Bobby latched on to him in the first place? I looked up at my mother, who was watching me with a mix of fear and sorrow. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I do not know," she whispered, "but I think Bobby is still out there, and I think he is looking for someone new." The weight of my father's letter pressed down on me like a lead blanket. Everything I thought I knew, about him, about my childhood, had been tainted by this specter named Bobby. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what it all meant. How could Bobby be real? Was he some kind of spirit, a demon, or just a figment of my father's disturbed mind? And if he was real, how had my father allowed him to take control? I sat in stunned silence, the letter still lying on the floor where it had fallen. My mother, sensing the gravity of my turmoil, spoke softly. "There's more," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "After your father passed, strange things started happening in this house." I looked up, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" "I would hear noises at night, footsteps, whispers, things moving on their own," she said, her hands trembling. "At first I thought it was just my grief, that I was imagining things because I missed him so much. But then I saw him." My blood ran cold. "You saw Bobby?" She nodded, her face pale. "I do not know if it was Bobby or something else, but it looked like him. I saw him standing in the hallway one night, just staring at me. He looked like a shadow, but there was something unmistakably human about him. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I felt a surge of fear grip me. My mother had always been a rational woman, never one to believe in the supernatural or the unexplained. If she was saying she had seen something, then there had to be some truth to it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "I didn't want to scare you," she said. "I thought maybe it would go away on its own, that it was just part of the grieving process. But now, after reading that letter, I know it's not. Bobby is still here, and I think he wants something." The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. I could feel a presence, something dark and malevolent, lurking just beyond the edges of my awareness. My father's words echoed in my mind. Bobby cannot be controlled. He is far more powerful than I ever realized. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "I don't know, but I can't stay here anymore. The longer I stay, the more I feel like he's watching me, waiting for something. I think he's trying to get to you through me." I stood up abruptly, the need to take action overpowering my fear. "You're coming with me," I said firmly. "We'll figure this out together. We can't let him take control." We gathered a few of her belongings and I helped her into my car. The drive back to my place was tense, both of us silent as we grappled with the reality of the situation. I had never believed in ghosts or demons, but now, with everything that had happened, I couldn't deny that something was wrong. Something very real and very dangerous was stalking us. That night, as we sat in my living room, I pulled out my laptop and started researching everything I could about Bobby. I dug through old police reports, historical records, and even local legends, hoping to find something that could explain who or what he was. But no matter how deep I searched, I found nothing that could definitively explain his existence. It was as if Bobby was a shadow that had slipped through the cracks of reality, something that didn't belong to this world, but had forced its way in nonetheless. And if my father's letter was any indication, he had been with him for years, possibly since childhood. But why? I leaned back in my chair, exhausted and frustrated. My mother had gone to bed, but I knew neither of us would sleep well tonight. The house was too quiet, too still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the hours ticked by, I found myself dozing off in my chair. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, just outside the edge of my consciousness. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a remnant of a dream slipping away as I woke. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Let me in." I jolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was unmistakable, low, gravelly, and full of malice. It sounded like it was coming from right outside my door. I stood up, every muscle in my body tensed. Slowly, I moved toward the door, half expecting to see nothing but the empty hallway beyond. But as I reached for the doorknob, the whisper came again. "Let me in." I froze, my hand hovering over the knob. The voice was closer now, almost as if it was right behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. I backed up against the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath in the cold air, as an oppressive sense of dread washed over me. I knew what was coming, even before I heard the next words. "I'm already here." The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its screen casting a faint glow as I tried to find the light switch. But before I could reach it, something cold brushed against my arm. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just empty space. My heart pounded in my chest as the room seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing down from all sides. And then I saw him. Standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. His face was hidden in shadow, but I knew, somehow, instinctively, that it was Bobby. He stood motionless, just watching me, his presence filling the room with an almost tangible sense of menace. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. But then, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let this thing control me the way it had controlled my father. I wasn't going to let Bobby win. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear and anger. "You're not welcome here." The figure didn't move, didn't react. He just stood there, silent and still, as if waiting for something. But I wasn't going to back down. "Get out!" I yelled again, louder this time, my voice echoing through the darkened room. And then, Just as suddenly as he had appeared, Bobby was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the oppressive cold lifted. I stood there, my heart still racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Bobby was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next opportunity, and I had no idea how to stop him.